Gracias a todos. Vamos a retomar el taller. Por favor, ¿me escucha, capitán Marcus?
Buenos días, mi almirante. Estamos listos acá.
Ok, listos. Siguiendo con la agenda, me permito presentar al capitán de navío Márcio Borges Ferreira, doctor en Oceanografía Física y graduado en la Escuela Naval de Brasil. Actualmente es el jefe de la División de Investigación del Colegio Interamericano de Defensa en Washington. Como comandante del buque de investigación hidrooceanográfica Vital de Oliveira, ha dirigido y ayudado a planificar investigaciones meteorológicas, geofísicas y oceanográficas en amplias zonas del Océano Atlántico Sur. Recientemente ejerció como asesor en la Oficina de Conocimiento del Dominio Marítimo, dependiente de la Dirección General de Navegación Marítima. También tiene experiencia en levantamiento batimétrico y operaciones en el Amazonas como comandante de buque. En la Antártida se desempeñó como jefe de operaciones del buque polar Almirante Maximiano durante los veranos australes entre el 2011 y 2003. Dejo con ustedes al señor comandante Márcio Borges.
Bom dia a todos, muito obrigado, é um prazer estar de volta a esse seminário, agora realizando essa apresentação. É muito difícil para mim, depois de brilhantes apresentações como foram realizadas ontem e hoje, tratar de questões inerentes às opacas e, particularmente, agora iniciar o painel de iniciativas internacionais. Próximo slide, por favor. Eu seguirei essa agenda tratando de uma introdução, o direito dos povos à paz, as opacas desde sua origem e o desenvolvimento da mesma, ações escondidas sobre nobres direitos que existem no alto mar, principalmente, e conclusões. Por favor. Essa pergunta é muito relevante, fazemos logo ao início da apresentação. Por que falar da Zona de Paz e Cooperação do Atlântico Sul? Uma resolução que foi estabelecida há 36 anos atrás e que o Brasil tem buscado, meu país particularmente, tem buscado fortalecer, inclusive incluindo no seu plano estratégico da Marinha, iniciativas para que essa zona de paz seja fortalecida. Antes de mais nada, precisamos olhar a situação atual que temos em termos de crescimento populacional no mundo. Vimos claramente, por essas estatísticas da Organização das Nações Unidas, que teremos nos próximos anos um crescimento populacional completamente desbalanceado. Nos próximos 10 anos, teremos 2 bilhões de pessoas a mais no mundo e apenas 6 milhões dessas pessoas estarão em países considerados desenvolvidos. Na maioria, esse crescimento populacional ocorrerá em regiões menos desenvolvidas, excluindo, é claro, a China, como encontra-se nesse gráfico, e em grande parte na África e também com contribuição desse crescimento na América Latina. Esse crescimento provocará o aprofundamento de situações de problemas que já temos. Teremos um aprofundamento da fome, da pobreza, teremos um aprofundamento de crises econômicas, teremos um desbalanceamento também em todo o sentido que afetará todos os campos da segurança multidimensional, como temos na nossa Declaração de Seguridade Multidimensional da OEA, assinada em 2003. Esse crescimento desbalanceado trará também uma grande migração, tanto por terra quanto por via marítima. E aí teremos o impacto desse crescimento desbalanceado na nossa safety, que desdobrará provavelmente para grandes problemas de segurança, de security, que nós já vimos em outras apresentações de outros brilhantes palestrantes nesse evento. Próximo, por favor. É muito interessante também perceber qual era o contexto em que as opacas foi estabelecida. Em 1984, as Nações Unidas estabeleceram, por meio da Resolução 39/11, a inclusão em sua carta do direito dos povos à paz. Esse direito dos povos à paz transcende muito mais qualquer paz associada apenas à ausência da guerra. O direito da paz, segundo a ONU, diz respeito, como destaca o autor Fried, de 1990, que a paz é baseada em vários mecanismos de cooperação que são dinamicamente conectados, não só honrando essas conexões entre esses mecanismos, mas também esses mecanismos são capazes de um grande impacto na sociedade. Assim, é necessário, para garantir a paz dos povos, cooperação, liberdade, independência, soberania nacional, igualdade, direitos humanos e também uma distribuição equânime, uma distribuição igual de recursos para todos os povos. Nesse sentido, as OPACAS foi estabelecida em 1986, a partir da Resolução 4111 de 86, com esse enfoque, nesse sentido mais amplo do direito à paz. Essa zona de paz, estabelecida em 86, visava estabelecer uma zona de paz no Atlântico, no Oceano Atlântico, particularmente no Atlântico Sul, mais limitado pela África e pela América do Sul. Um pouco mais ao norte, além da latitude de 0 graus, o sentido das OPACAS transcende um pouco a questão, vai também para o Atlântico Equatorial, segue também para o Atlântico Equatorial, chegando um pouco mais ao norte. Nesse sentido mais amplo de paz, a resolução visa estabelecer uma zona de paz e cooperação para o Atlântico Sul. Essa cooperação visa, principalmente, na resolução que estabeleceu as OPACAS, o desenvolvimento econômico e social da região, a proteção do meio ambiente marinho e a conservação de recursos vivos. Já nessa época, há 36 anos atrás, as OPACAS já visavam principalmente esses objetivos. E, é claro, todos esses objetivos, congraçados, unidos, levarão à paz e à segurança em toda a região. É muito importante também observar o cenário de aprovação das OPACAS na Assembleia Geral da ONU à época. Não, embora o sentido das OPACAS seja um sentido de defesa da paz de uma maneira muito ampla, ela não teve o apoio de todas as nações, infelizmente, na época. As OPACAS recebeu 1 voto contrário e 8 abstenções no momento de seu estabelecimento, muito por conta de outras medidas que encontravam-se na resolução, como manter o Pacífico Sul, o Atlântico Sul como uma zona livre de armas nucleares, evitar a influência extracontinental e evitar a presença de nações extracontinentais, a presença militar no Atlântico Sul, e também evitar a extensão de rivalidades e conflitos para a região. Isso, é claro, num período de Guerra Fria, todos os senhores já conhecem, recebeu resistências de nações que estavam vivendo um mundo polarizado. E agora nós temos uma realidade completamente diferente. Além disso, também existia nas OPACAS o respeito à unidade nacional, à soberania, à independência política e à integridade territorial de cada um dos países que compõem essa aliança. Haviam iniciativas muito importantes e que foram muito apoiadas na ONU na época, como a eliminação do apartheid na África do Sul e o fortalecimento da independência da Namíbia. Entretanto, as OPACAS não mencionou em sua resolução o movimento para a libertação da Angola, que era um movimento que, à época, recebia um grande apoio da União das Repúblicas Socialistas Soviéticas à época, e, por isso, também, por não mencioná-lo, as OPACAS teve certa objeção na ONU. É importante pontuar que o voto contrário e as abstenções para as opacas foram declaradamente motivados por uma preocupação do comprometimento do direito de liberdade de navegação em alto mar, porque essa já se tratava uma zona de paz para uma bacia, para um oceano. Então, é um acordo de bacia oceânica, um acordo que vislumbra uma região de paz muito mais ambiciosa que as áreas jurisdicionais dos países. Nessa figura, nós vemos um fenômeno, eu coloquei aqui, do derramamento de óleo, já mencionado pelo senhor Almirante Garriga, que atingiu a costa do Nordeste do Brasil. Eu só queria pontuar esse derramamento de óleo pelas investigações conduzidas pela Marinha, pelo órgão, pelo comitê que foi estabelecido para investigá-lo, claramente ocorreu no alto mar, e o óleo atingiu a costa brasileira. Por favor. Já em 1994, as opacas, mais uma vez, teve uma resolução tentando trazer o seu fortalecimento e reforçando que a paz, a segurança e o desenvolvimento são diretamente relacionados. Eles não podem ser separados um do outro. Estão diretamente relacionados. Paz, segurança e desenvolvimento dos países. Também, essa resolução chamou a atenção para que a poluição ameaça o meio ambiente marinho e costeiro e também depedra o balanço ecológico e o equilíbrio ecológico e a sustentabilidade da exploração desses recursos vivos. Também nessa resolução, as opacas, em 1994, aponta preocupações já em 94 com métodos e práticas que podem provocar uma sobrepesca e também uma exploração em demasiado desordenada dos recursos marinhos, principalmente de espécies migratórias, que são capturadas, em maioria, no alto mar, tanto dentro das zonas econômicas exclusivas dos países, quanto além dessas regiões, no que chamamos de alto mar. Durante o Congresso das Opacas, realizado em outubro de 2020, mais uma vez foram promovidas ações para incrementar a cooperação entre os países, os 24 países que são signatários da aliança. As ameaças apresentadas o presidente brasileiro, inclusive, mencionou que as ameaças que são, e foi muito destacado isso durante a conferência, que as ameaças impostas pela pesca ilegal, o tráfico de drogas e a pirataria são ameaças veementemente que comprometem o desenvolvimento econômico dos países e a manutenção dessa zona de paz. Faz-se necessário melhorar cada vez mais os mecanismos para incrementar o compartilhamento de informações, principalmente para controle de tráfego marítimo, para que tenhamos ferramentas para coibir essas ações nas nossas águas jurisdicionais. E todas essas ações, é claro, contribuirão para o desenvolvimento econômico, para a segurança marítima, no sentido da salvaguarda, no sentido da safety, e também no sentido da security, em todo o Atlântico Sul. É importante mencionar o contexto atual, o que nós vivemos hoje em dia. Estamos, esse ano, completando 40 anos da declaração da Convenção das Nações Unidas para o Direito do Mar. Nesses 40 anos, nós vivemos o quê? A Convenção teve um grande avanço em termos de águas jurisdicionais, os direitos garantidos em águas jurisdicionais, e estabeleceu o direito à liberdade de navegação, que hoje, infelizmente, é utilizado para esconder diversas ações em alto mar, como vemos agora aqui nessa figura de Sala e Colaboradores 2018, os grandes esforços pesqueiros que são conduzidos em alto mar. Na maioria, por navios pesqueiros que são embandeirados, são registrados em países fora da nossa zona de paz e cooperação, fora da América Latina e da África. E a ação desses navios ocorre não só no Atlântico Sul, mas também, reconhecidamente, no Pacífico, como já observamos nas apresentações dos almirantes do Peru e do Equador, essas ações e da Colômbia claramente ocorrendo também no Pacífico. Quando esses navios adentram as águas jurisdicionais, problema algum, ocorre a apreensão dos mesmos, como ocorreu quando o Arabochá fez a apreensão desse navio que invadiu, esse navio chinês pesqueiro que invadiu as águas jurisdicionais argentinas recentemente. O incremento da pesca ilegal leva diretamente a um aumento da pirataria. Há registros que na região da Somália, os pescadores que deixavam a sua atividade laboral principal de pesca e não tinham como sobreviver, dedicavam-se à pirataria, para que pudessem conseguir recursos para a sua sobrevivência. Então, a pesca ilegal ocorrida em alto mar faz com que os estoques pesqueiros também em águas jurisdicionais reduzam-se e esses pescadores artesanais passam a se dedicar à pirataria. Tem-se registros de que da FAO, da Organização das Nações Unidas para Alimentação e Agricultura, de que 64% das espécies pescadas em alto mar sofrem sobrepesca. As espécies que são única e exclusivamente habitáveis, que habitam única e exclusivamente águas jurisdicionais, sofrem apenas 28% de sobrepesca. Isso denota claramente um descontrole do alto mar, que infelizmente impacta as águas jurisdicionais. Operações muito importantes, como já mencionadas pelo almirante Garriga, da Marinha do Brasil, são operações como a Urban Game, em que ocorre diretamente uma transferência tanto de conhecimentos quanto de práticas e ensinamentos para as nações que vivem o problema da pirataria agora, particularmente no Golfo da Guiné. E essas operações são apoiadas pelo Brasil e têm ampla participação dos membros das OPACas. Como conclusões, eu gostaria de enfatizar algumas mensagens principais. Estamos falando, principalmente nessa apresentação, de um acordo de bacia, um acordo para o Atlântico. Estamos esse ano completando 40 anos da Convenção das Nações Unidas para o Direito do Mar. Claramente vimos que temos hoje, pela década dos oceanos e por esse aniversário de 40 anos da Convenção, uma oportunidade ímpar para que tenhamos o fortalecimento das OPACas como um acordo de bacia, sim, para uma mudança de paradigma em termos de legislação internacional, para que avancemos em questões de maior monitoramento das atividades que ocorrem em alto mar. Dessa maneira, as OPACas podem sim fortalecer uma maior cooperação e compartilhamento de informações entre os países que são limítrofes à nossa bacia do Atlântico, um maior fortalecimento de acordos multilaterais para, principalmente, fazer com que os países se unam contra práticas de transbordo e transferência de pescado capturado ilegalmente em alto mar faça esse transbordo e a legalização desse pescado dentro de águas jurisdicionais, melhorar o monitoramento do tráfego marítimo além das águas jurisdicionais, para melhorar também uma ação antecipada dentro dessas águas jurisdicionais, reforçar as ações, porque todas essas ações estão diretamente ligadas, como os senhores já viram, a pesca ilegal alimenta também outros crimes, porque ela não é lucrativa, e para se manter, tem necessidade de ter outros crimes associados. Reforçar a cooperação e, sim, também fortalecer o pleito que já existe na ONU para o estabelecimento de áreas protegidas em alto mar, muito além das águas jurisdicionais, áreas protegidas do meio ambiente em alto mar. É um grande chamamento às OPACas para uma maior cooperação também visando o alto mar. Desculpe eu ter me estendido um pouco mais, agradeço a oportunidade e permanecerei à disposição para outras perguntas ao final. Muito obrigado.
Marcio Borges, muy interesante su presentación. A continuación, el general de brigada Fritz Burbach de Alemania. Actualmente se desempeña como agregado militar de la Unión Europea en Estados Unidos y Europa. Ingresó al servicio con el arma de infantería en el año 1977. Ha desempeñado múltiples cargos, tanto administrativos como operativos, entre los que se pueden destacar los siguientes. Comandante del Batallón de Infantería Aerotransportada 262, comandante de las Fuerzas Armadas Alemanas como G3, comandante del Centro Internacional de Entrenamiento Especial para las Fuerzas Especiales, comandante del Mando Conjunto de Operaciones Especiales, jefe de Subdivisión de Política de Seguridad de los Despliegues Operativos de la ONU. Entre los principales cursos realizados se destacan los siguientes: curso de Estado Mayor alemán, curso de Estado Mayor francés, curso de comandantes conjuntos en el Centro de Altos Estudios Militares en París, Francia. Con ustedes, el señor general de brigada Fritz Urbach.
Admirals, generals, gentlemen. Buenos dias, bon dia. But that's where my Spanish and my Portuguese ends. I only can say simulación del trabajo, but I think that's. I'm feeling very exotic in this Navy-dominated environment. My naval experience is very limited. I had 1 day on a German speedboat. I had 1 day on a Norwegian rib in the high Norwegian north, and I spent 2 days on French aircraft carriers. So in total, 4 days of Navy experience.
You're welcome aboard, sir.
Thank you very much, Admiral. It's an honor to brief this distinguished audience. Please, next slide. Yes, next slide. That's the next, please. That's the agenda that I suggest for these 15 minutes. So I will give you a short overview what the EU as a military actor is doing, then go to our understanding how we do maritime business. We'll expand on 2 naval operations, Atalanta and Irini, and then an interesting new activity which is called Coordinated Maritime Presence before I conclude. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So one back. Some preliminary remarks. The EU is not a security and defense actor in the Americas and in the Caribbean. We have a different geographic focus. However, there might be some interesting aspects how we are approaching our challenges and problems and threats also for this audience here. So there might be some similarities, and the slides my predecessor, the Brazilian colleague just show there are many similarities. We have no European armed forces. Everything we have in our operations is generated, is given, is committed by the member states. We have only one common military instrument, that's the EU military staff, 250 people in Brussels, providing command and control for the training missions and being the interface between the military operations and the political leadership in Brussels. Next slide. So this is a very busy slide that gives you an overview. We have currently 3 military operations. One is in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the Balkans, and the 2 maritime operations. I will expand on them. We have 4 military training missions, all of them in Africa. And we have 11 civil missions, mainly capacity building, monitoring. You see the geographic focus is Africa and our closer neighborhood. Next slide. So what is our threat perception? And that's where I just said there are a couple of similarities. So you are facing the same challenges we are doing, only in different geographic areas. So next slide. We have what I would call the classic defense threats or challenges. when our member states are directly threatened by force, when the freedom of navigation is at risk, or when our citizens or the economic interests, and we have some, as you know, are at risk as well. Next slide. So these pictures, these bullet points will look familiar to you. We are facing cross-border and organized crime in our neighborhood, piracy, not in our closer neighborhood, but in sea lines of communication, which are very important for us economy-wise. Terrorism and international unlawful acts don't know any borders, so they are everywhere. Proliferation of arms, mass destruction, and changes in maritime transport system, which is a very very important issue. We have seen it with the interruption of lines of communication and support in the pandemic phases. Next slide. And that's, I think that's every sailor's daily business, SOLAS, and monitoring and, if possible, fighting environmental risks. So that's more or less the same, only in different geographic areas. Next slide, please. So what is our approach? Our approach, next slide, is to decide on external action. That means operations and missions, so military stuff. We have to improve our maritime awareness, and then we have to bring together for this military and civil capabilities. Capability development in partner countries, as you have seen, mainly in Africa. Risk management, protection of critical maritime infrastructure, crisis response, and the last one, increased research, innovation, education. That is our own member states' business, where we have to become better. Now, what does that mean? Next slide. The typical EU integrated approach is that a military operation or mission is always only one element in a larger civil military approach and effort. We have to find consensus among all member states, 27. It's not easy. It may take some time, but once we have the blessing, the political blessing of all member states, we can move ahead. And then this consensus gives us a strong position. In the operations and missions, we always combine civil and military activities. On the civil side, we have capacity building, we have police forces, we have gendarmeries, we have funds to improve infrastructure in the areas of operation. We can give incentives for development in these countries. We support rule of law. I already talked about fourth generation, the role of the EU military staff. From time to time, it looks a bit as if the EU is a beggar, begging for ships, aircraft, troops. Without the member states, we cannot do everything. They own the ships, the frigates, the MPAs, you name it. The last point is very important. We, in our operations and missions, are always open to accommodate and to welcome third countries. As an example, in the maritime operation Atalanta, we have ships from India that chop in and chop out. We have ships from South Korea. In a training mission in Central African Republic, we have soldiers from Brazil supporting the Portuguese contingent. We have in several operations soldiers from Serbia. So all these activities are open to third country participation. Next slide, please. So just to highlight briefly the purely maritime activities, the first, next slide, is the Operation Atalanta. We have this operation, please next slide. We have this operation since 2008. It started, you don't see it very clearly, the red rectangular line, that's the area of responsibility, so quite big. Started as a counter-piracy operations because we had many piracy acts in and around the Horn of Africa. Since then, there was an evolution of tasks. This area is far too strategically, far too relevant, interesting for our interests and sea lines of communication to leave this area to other actors like China or the Emirates or others. So a whole bunch of activities and tasks, a success story because piracy acts went down, but other illegal activities are still there. The other maritime operation, next slide, is a bit younger. It's the Operation Irini, launched in 2019. It's off the Libyan coast, and Libya was the trigger to launch this operation. We had the civil war in Libya, a completely destabilized situation on the other side of the Mediterranean, seen from Europe. There was an arms embargo by the United Nations, and we are actively implementing this arms embargo. And as a secondary task, we train the Libyan Coast Guard, because the last bullet, contribute to disrupt human smuggling and trafficking networks. That's very significant because, as you know, we have a permanent migration pressure coming from Africa and from Asia. And we have mainly three routes: the western route going through Spain, Portugal, the central route going from Africa to, and mainly Libya, to Italy, and the eastern route going through Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, and then through the Balkans. And if you, with a big effort, a big civil and military effort, disrupt one route, the others are more used. So it's like communicating tubes. But that's a secondary task they are dealing with. And these pictures are not there to show off. These are the assets we really use in this operation. So we have satellite imagery, we have drones, and we have even submarines to show the flag and to improve the intelligence picture in the area of responsibility. Next slide. So that's the latest tool called Coordinated Maritime Presence. So what happened in the past? Many maritime areas without any coordinated naval presence by the European Union. And as I told you, we don't have own ships and frigates. So we must coordinate the national maritime activities of our member states. You know this business. There's a port visit of the Spanish frigate during a training or an exercise somewhere in an African port. The French are with a carrier group on its way to the Indian Ocean. The Germans are having a deployment with their school frigate, you name it. The idea is that we have a better coordination on the European level to have a sustained maritime presence in, not everywhere, of course, we can't do it. We have 2 maritime areas of interest. And the member states came up with the first area, which is the Gulf of Guinea, because we have a lot of organized crime, not that much piracy, but organized crime, ransom, and other nasty activities. So that was the first area of maritime interest. And the second has just been launched. It's on the right side of the slide, showing this black box. That's the northwestern Indian Ocean, where we want to have a better coordinated presence. And if the French are traveling through this area, or the Germans are heading to, let's say, Dar es Salaam for a port visit, why shouldn't they put and add the European flag to their national flag and respond to this European presence coordination, to have a more sustained and a planned, coordinated European presence in these 2 areas of interest. These activities are again open to third country participation, no doubt about this. This is coordinated by a small cell, I think 4 or 5 officers and NCOs within the EU military staff in Brussels. So they are trying, and they are telling the Portuguese, couldn't you push a bit your deployment 2 weeks further down? And then we have a continued presence because the Germans are leaving this area a bit earlier. So that's the kind of coordination business. And then, as I said, to add the European flag to their national flag. Next slide. So I come to the conclusion and to the end. Next slide. I think everybody agrees on these key bullets, and there's no geographic difference between you and us. Again, for the third, it was very clear in the briefings I listened to that there is no national way. There is only a coordinated international, multinational way. We have the integrated approach. That's the big advantage. If you take, for example, NATO has no civil leverages and no civil tools to do business. They have military hard power, and that's okay, that's good. That's their mission, that's their core business. We are able to have this integrated approach because we can combine civil and military means. So EU as a global military security provider, that's still some a bit wishful thinking, science fiction. So we are happy that we manage our operations, our missions with a geographic focus in Africa and in our closer neighborhood. And let's see when the next step comes to the Indian Ocean and perhaps to the Pacific. But for the time being, that's still some time ahead. That concludes my briefing. Last slide, please. I think there were plenty of aspects I learned this morning, and perhaps you have seen some aspects where we are closer together than we think, despite the geographic difference and distance. And I think there are good opportunities for further exchanges. That's why I'm very happy that I've been invited to join the EADB as an observer. And I'm ready to answer questions and sidebars or afterwards. and I'm here in DC, you're in DC, or most of them are in DC. So I'm ready to continue this dialogue exchange. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos la magnífica presentación del señor general Fritz Urbach, que nos ha permitido comprender el punto de vista de la Unión Europea sobre su estrategia sobre seguridad marítima. Muy amable. A continuación, el máster Timothy Walker. Es el jefe del proyecto marítimo e investigador principal del Instituto de Seguridad de África, de Pretoria. Desde el 2011 ha trabajado para promover la seguridad marítima como una prioridad política con organizaciones como la Unión Africana, la Comunidad Económica de Estados de África Occidental, la Autoridad Intergubernamental para el Desarrollo, la Comunidad para el Desarrollo del África Meridional y la Asociación de la Cuenca del Océano Índico. Tiene una maestría en estudios políticos e internacionales por la Universidad de Rhodes de Sudáfrica. Con ustedes, el máster Timothy Walker.
Thank you very much, Admiral, and thank you very much to the organizers for asking me to address this event today. I'm very honored and also very keen to engage with some of the perspectives, some of the fascinating things we've heard so far. I'm going to pick up on some of those facts and try and weave them into what I want to say too. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope you can. Please, could you just indicate if you can see the presentation? Okay.
Yes, Master.
Thank you so much. I've been asked and intend to speak to you today on strengthening of African maritime security institutions, organizations, and indeed the growth of African agency in the maritime domain, a topic which is sometimes often overlooked, is sometimes not very visible, but hopefully by the end, a couple of interesting questions and hopefully areas for future engagement will have suggested themselves. I always like to start my presentations by showing you this photo, which is called the Blue Marble. It was taken in 1972, very famous photo by the Apollo 17 mission to the moon, the last mission to the moon. When the astronauts took the photo of the Earth from inside their spaceship, that was how the Earth appeared to them. Ordinarily or typically what we do is we flip the photo around, so the north is at the top of the photo. But I like the way that this photo displays the overwhelming ocean nature of the world. The fact that the storms, the weather patterns, and indeed just the color blue shows that when we call the Earth, perhaps we should actually be calling it ocean or sea. What it also suggests is the need to turn received wisdom or taken for granted knowledge on its head. This is the challenge facing, in particular, people coming from Africa who wish to engage or speak about maritime or naval policy. We need to be looking at our planet in different ways than what we are normally told or presented as the normal view. To engage in maritime security debates from an African perspective is to come from a smaller perspective, somewhere which is not often very clear. So I like to show this photo, as I say, is one of the major historical photos as it was taken, that perhaps we should be looking at the world a lot more often like this. What I also like, and it leads to my next photo, is that with the Suez Canal, Africa is in effect a large or a big island. And we must not forget that fact. Even when, as we all no doubt recall in 2021, the Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal. Sorry, I've gone too far. Effectively creating a link between Africa and the rest of the world again, stopping it from being an island. But what it illustrated, as we're increasingly becoming more insecure about, I think, around the world, are the threats to global trade, which can come from seemingly minor or indirect causes, that lead to general insecurity. The Ever Given, as we know, it could have been worse. There would have been no way to have taken those containers off the ship if it could not have been moved. And perhaps the Suez Canal would have been impassable for even perhaps until today, although that's perhaps a question that more for another time. The reason I want to show this photo, and indeed the one on the right, which I'll address now, is that Africa's markets, the greatest value in markets, the primary trading partners through imports and exports, are located overseas. And because Africa, the majority of its exports and imports, the majority of its exports are raw materials, which are carried by ships. They cannot be carried by airplane. And as Africa is an island, they have to leave from ports via ship. And because Africa does not manufacture many of the goods, or even indeed trade intra-Africa, trade is very small, that manufactured goods are shipped in from overseas markets as well. Without safe and secure, reliable seas, without the security of shipping, Africa would not be able to function effectively. And given that there are 16 landlocked countries as well, the highest number of any continent, and that many countries which are coastal are huge, that the pressure then on something which is often seen, or rather is not seen as a high political priority, or indeed often talked about as an African priority, needs to be addressed. The picture on the right is a similar incident which occurred in 2017 in Durban in South Africa. Durban is the primary port in Southern Africa for most of the countries in Southern Africa, all the way up to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Unlike Europe, unlike perhaps other countries in North and South America, there are very few alternatives if an African port is rendered unpassable, or you are not able to trade in and out of that port. And so a cyclone, this actually links a little bit back to what Rear Admiral Monigo was saying earlier about the prevalence or the importance to consider natural disasters, and the fact that cyclones in Southern Africa are worsening and their impact on coastal areas is increasing. Luckily, this ship did not block the harbor for too long, but if it had sunk, or if there'd been a worse kind of catastrophe, it would have been, again, another threatening case of where a case of maritime safety and maritime insecurity has huge indirect effects, not just on coastal communities, but all the way inland as well, and has seriously impacted economic growth, trade, and indeed something which, with the recovery from COVID, we still need to be prioritizing just to get back to often the level of economic functioning that we were at prior to the pandemic. I want to explain briefly as well that from the presentations that I've been very privileged to listen to over the last day has been that you have two concepts here coming into play. And I'm sorry if they don't translate very well or very easily out of English, but you have effectively maritime geopolitics. And we're talking here increasingly, and it links to what Brigadier General Urbach was saying just now, about the presence of major navies in particular areas of the world where there is insecurity. So you have an importance of maritime geopolitics and the use of navies as an instrument of foreign policy. And you have what is effectively quite a complicated maritime political geography. The maritime domain itself, as determined, as we saw in some of the previous slides, in terms of the zones which extend from your coastline, actually do create a number of paradoxes and a number of potential dispute areas which African countries have not either had the opportunity or have had to defer focusing on because there have been more pressing issues inland and on land. But what we are increasingly seeing is greater interest in declaring and determining fixed zones at sea so that very lucrative concession areas can be drawn up and auctioned for bidders from exploratory companies like Total, SA, oil companies like ExxonMobil, very present, Chevron, very present in these parts of African waters. And that, as you can see on the left, the Democratic Republic of Congo has an absolutely minuscule area in which it can claim rights at sea. And if we take a broader look at the African continent itself, that there are huge areas where countries are clustered together now, the Gulf of Guinea and the Mozambique Channel, where the jurisdiction and the right to have the claim to those resources located in these zones is becoming a higher and higher priority. One, because it is a source of revenue, but two, it could be the source of future energy security and indeed food security and job security. One of the presentations earlier talked of the population growth which the world is experiencing, in particular Africa. And what we must always remember is that Africa is also the youngest continent and will continue to be the youngest continent. There are increasing numbers of people heading to coastal areas because that is where there is food in terms of potential of fishing. There is therefore the potential of jobs. And it is a site where, because of overseas markets, places like China or Europe or South America or North America, that investments are heading into ports to make them more effective and to be able to anchor economic growth. So that means that you have increasing numbers of people looking to the coastlines as an area in which their human security could be better assured. I would add as well that climate change and the effects of climate change in many inland areas, and indeed insecurity and insurgencies, such as we see in Mali, Niger, the Sahel region, and now in Mozambique and parts of East Africa, are also pushing people towards the coast as well. But within these coastal areas, as we've heard from one of the previous presentations, illegal fishing is an incredibly difficult thing to prevent. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do anything about. Many African navies do not have the capabilities or the awareness often to be able to intercept, to provide a deterrent effect. So therefore, we're looking at a number of situations in the future which could cause insecurity if they are not addressed soon. I'd just like to highlight as well, I've mentioned the Mozambique Channel, that there are certain areas within Africa's maritime political map where there are disputes over sovereignty. And as we all know, the ability to have an EEZ around a piece of land or an island or projected from your coastline does entitle you to a great number of resources. But there are many areas still which are considered or are considered to not have been decolonized yet. And there are disputes between countries such as Madagascar, Mauritius, the Comoros, and Mauritius, with countries such as France and the United Kingdom. And those are issues which will, if they don't play out in a maritime sense between navies or with the presence of naval patrols, they will play out in other areas. And we've seen this with the Kenya-Somalia dispute. There are two important things I'd just like to highlight with the Kenya-Somalia map on the right. One is that given that land boundaries determine the direction of the lines which will be drawn out to sea, which give you the EEZ or the zones at sea, and given that African land boundaries were often very arbitrarily made, that there are a number of areas in which there are transboundary resources which are going to become, as you saw from the previous slide, increasingly sought after, maybe because of the licensing and the concessions, but also because countries will want to have those resources secured or provided for future population growth. So the Kenya-Somalia boundary dispute was interesting because, as you can see, even a tiny change in the orientation of the boundary from the land as it hits the sea and projects out to sea by the time you reach 200 nautical miles, has an enormous degree of resources potentially contained within that area. And many African countries who are now waking up to the importance of having possession or having the claim and being able to enforce law within these areas regard it as territory, even though under UNCLOS, as we know, the EEZ is not the exclusive sovereignty of a coastal state. Nevertheless, when these issues are framed or described by politicians or in Twitter or social media, it is often in the language which can be very inflammatory. And therefore, we have to bear in mind that those are very important background influences which will always be present in Africa, because Kenya, Somalia is one instance. But as you can see from other parts of the African continent, there are many areas in which these boundaries have never been properly determined, and they are likely to be the source of disputes unless they are subject to diplomacy. And it's unfortunate with the Kenya-Somalia incident that because you do not have two countries, or in Somalia's case, a country which is not very effectively able to exist in many places of what it claims are its territory still, that the disputes don't play out at sea, as we see in some areas of the world. They play out in other areas. You have ambassadors being expelled. You have citizens of each other's country being denied visas. You have potential for disputes between various economic sectors. So maritime insecurity and debates or disputes don't necessarily just limit themselves to the sea. They play out sometimes indirectly in Africa on land. It's very important to also show that, and I'm focusing here on East Africa and the Mozambique Channel, but this does apply in some of the things I'm going to say applies to other parts of the continent too, that there is an enormous amount of clandestine smuggling and trafficking using ships, which is not easily trackable, or when we talk of maritime domain awareness, situational awareness, the ability to have intelligence on what is transpiring at sea is overwhelmed by the sheer amount of vessels which cannot be tracked, and the fact that there are groups and networks which have become very experienced and capable at operating clandestinely and making sure that if it is a particular thing such as drugs or a particular thing such as an activity such as illegal fishing, that it is able to carry on often without much interference. What makes Mozambique and Tanzania's border very interesting is, I'm sure many of you are aware that this is where a major insurgency is happening, where several countries have deployed troops, including South Africa, to halt the spread of an insurgency which has been very brutal, which has led to almost 1 million people being displaced. And going back to what Rear Admiral Moningo was saying as well just now, this is an area where cyclones and natural disasters are getting worse too. You have more people heading to the coast, sometimes fleeing, fighting inland, looking to take a boat to somewhere of safety, therefore putting themselves sometimes in the hands of human traffickers who provide, in effect, a service of sorts. But also you have tremendously destructive weather conditions changing and causing enormous problems with things like humanitarian relief, destroying roads, washing away bridges. It is really the seas and the use of ships which are the only means to sometimes carry what is required to where it is needed. And Mozambique being a particular example. But there are other places too where it is all down to shipping for the majority of goods and services. This is also a place where enormous gas resources have been discovered too. And indeed, I think much of the interest from the rest of the world in what we might call African maritime security challenges is driven by the fact that countries are looking to Mozambique in particular as a source of liquid natural gas for their energy policies, and especially in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that alternative sources are being sought for gas. So there is tremendous interest. But as you can see, this is an area already very well covered in the sense of it being pervasive and full of clandestine, illegal maritime crime. And it could not take too much to potentially recruit or for organizations to shift into different practices. I just, by way of summing up, just have a few more pictures I just want to discuss. This is a picture of Pemba, which is the regional capital of Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique. And why I'm showing you this photo is it raises a couple of very serious problems around interoperability between regional countries, which is an Africa-wide problem, and the fact that it does indicate that sometimes national governments are not often either responsive or are creating issues which their citizens will have a grievance about in future. Now, many of these vessels you can see, including, if you can see my mouse, these ones here, were purchased by the Mozambique government with a series of loans which it took or guaranteed from banks such as Credit Suisse in 2013, which has all done illegally, which was shown to be illegal, and in American courts, a lot of this is on record, that approximately $2 billion worth of naval equipment, which would be ideal for the purposes of intercepting these smugglers, for the purposes of providing security for refugees or protecting humanitarian ships coming in, is, as you can see, rusting away on the side of the beach. There has been very little in the way of a grand maritime strategy or even national maritime strategies which align with their neighbors. And I think that's something which we have a lot to learn from, potentially from CARICOM. And Captain Don Polo's discussion earlier of CARICOM was very fascinating in that regard. I think the problems which several countries have encountered in coordinating and gaining interoperability and ensuring that there is a common response to what are effectively common problems is strengthened. As I say, there's almost 1 million refugees who have fled their homes in northern Mozambique, and many of them do come via ship and seek refuge here. So to see $2 billion worth of rusting equipment, which could have been integral to saving one's life and livelihood, is very frustrating. Finally, just showing that these three photos, the two at the top and the one on the left, are 3 generations of South African naval vessels which have been patrolling in the Mozambique Channel for the last 10 years against pirates, or in the name of fighting piracy. But what has happened with the insurgency in countries now intervening with their armies, and indeed the photo on the bottom right is a Rwandan series of vessels taken from Lake Kivu and brought to Mozambique. So you have a paradox often of a landlocked country without a navy being effectively the ones who are seen to be providing maritime security. And I think in that regard, despite the heavy presence of South Africa's navy in this region, and indeed other navies such as India, France, and the United States and the UK, a confusing picture is what is often presented, and it's not the best way to fully grasp the challenges of creating maritime security. With that, I'd like to thank you for giving me the time to address you today, and I look forward to discussing it with you. If not today, then please do get in contact with us. We are here to discuss and engage as much as you'd like, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Muy amable, Máster, por sus valiosos comentarios que sirve para comprender su punto de vista y sus experiencias. A continuación, el señor Peter Adams de la Organización Marítima Internacional, en la actualidad se desempeña como asesor especial del secretario general sobre seguridad marítima en la Organización Marítima Internacional. Es un oficial retirado de la Marina Real con experiencia de mando. Entre los aspectos más destacados en sus operaciones se encuentran la aplicación de las sanciones de la ONU en la antigua Yugoslavia, las operaciones de lucha contra los narcóticos en el Caribe, operaciones de lucha contra la piratería en el Cuerno de África, la represión de la delincuencia marítima en Hong Kong. Tuvo la experiencia de navegar en el portaaviones Invencible de la Armada de Inglaterra, que operaba en la zona de exclusión aérea al sur de Irak. Lamentablemente, por cuestiones personales y trabajo, el señor Peter Adams no puede estar presente y nos ha dejado un audio que lo vamos a escuchar a continuación.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And first of all, let me apologise for my absence. I've been called away for a meeting which I don't have any other choice but to attend. And consequently, I've recorded my speech in order that hopefully it can be of some use to you. I've been asked to provide a short brief to outline some current global maritime security threats. I work for the IMO, which is the specialist agency of the United Nations, responsible to our 175 member states for safe, secure, and efficient shipping, and for the prevention of pollution of ships. I lead the maritime security effort at IMO through regulation, such as the International Ship and Port Facility Security Code, the ISPS code, and the Convention on the Suppression of Unlawful Acts, the SUA Convention, and through capacity building, through our global programme, aimed at supporting the implementation of the ISPS code and helping ports and ships to enhance their security measures. IMO also uses its GISIS database to record security status of ports and incidents of piracy and armed robbery. So, what are the maritime security hotspots that IMO is most concerned about today? I'll provide an update on piracy and armed robbery, and then look briefly at the situation in Ukraine. So almost all acts of piracy and armed robbery take place within poverty-stricken regions within 10 degrees of the equator. According to information received and made available to the IMO's GISIS database, 172 incidents of piracy and armed robbery against ships were reported to the organisation as having occurred or been attempted in 2021. In 2020, 229 incidents were reported. This therefore constitutes a decrease of approximately 25%. So looking first at the Horn of Africa, at Somali pirates. Between 2005 and 2017, the Horn of Africa was the source of the highest number of piracy incidents globally. The modus operandi being taking ships and holding them for ransom. However, there have been no piracy incidents reported off the coast of Somalia or in the Gulf of Aden since 2019. And importantly, this resulted in Somalia not agreeing to the extension of the United Nations Security Council resolution, UNSCR 2608, which expired in March this year. UNSCR 2608 empowered naval forces and aircraft to enter Somali territorial waters to support counter-piracy measures. EU NAVFOR, the European-led multinational naval force, which have been continually deployed in the area for 15 years, are for now continuing to operate in the area off the Horn of Africa. However, there will be ongoing questions about their sustained deployment as their primary mandate has now been removed. EU NAVFOR's most recent intelligence briefings offer that piracy in the region has not been eradicated but merely suppressed. This is based on the fact that the underlying drivers of piracy are still in place, and consequently, if the deterrent is removed, the piracy will return. The counter-argument provided by Somalia is that there have been no incidents for many years, and the UNSCR and the warships are scaring away trade from Somalia and damaging the ability for their blue economy to grow. Now, only once the deterrent is reduced will it become clear if the piracy will return. Moving across to the Gulf of Guinea. As piracy numbers in East Africa fell, they rose in the Gulf of Guinea. In West Africa, primarily emanating from the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, pirates used a different modus operandi: kidnap for ransom. The number of incidents that took place in the Gulf of Guinea decreased by 58% in 2021. However, this fall doesn't fully reflect the recent dramatic fall in piracy incidents in the Gulf of Guinea. Since October 2021, piracy and armed robbery has all but completely stopped, and the question is why? There have clearly been significant increases in the counter-piracy efforts over recent years, including increased non-regional naval presence, piracy convictions in Nigeria and neighbouring countries, Nigeria's Deep Blue project and enhanced naval patrols, and the deterrent posed by the actions of the Danish frigate in engaging suspected pirates in the area. I personally suspect that the fall is a result of the combination of these, also combined with Nigeria's enhanced efforts ashore, particularly in view of the impending elections in early 2023. Nigeria's economy was starting to be affected by both the loss of trade and the cost to trade due to the piracy impact. Ships' crews didn't want to go to the area, and increases in insurance and the cost of armed guards and security transits were all affecting the volumes of trade. It's also important to consider piracy is a business, and the elevated oil prices will also have drawn criminal elements towards more lucrative oil theft, particularly as the counter-piracy efforts have been significantly enhanced, and there is now a credible threat of prosecution for captured pirates. The average ransom paid for a hostage in the Gulf of Guinea is $50,000. Even with 200 cases of kidnap for ransom, the total of $10 million is substantially less than the cost of the deterrent. So, piracy levels have fallen in the Horn of Africa and have also fallen in the Gulf of Guinea. The most significant increase reported last year were in the Strait of Malacca. The number of incidents of piracy and armed robbery against ships increased to 69, a 43% increase on 2020, and nearly 80% of these attacks targeted a ship that was underway, compared with a global average of 58%. Most of these attacks were low level and emanate from a few islands east of Malacca. Pirates generally were armed with knives and steal equipment and goods they can find on deck. These were, broadly speaking, opportunist attacks. So in summary, global piracy levels have reduced, but it will be important to see what happens in the post-COVID environment, and particularly if the impending global food shortage becomes a reality. And this brings me nicely across to the situation in Ukraine. On February the 24th, when Russia invaded, Ukraine declared MARSEC Level 3, a risk of imminent threat. All the ports were closed, minefields were laid in port approaches, and barges and cranes were sunken in harbour entrances. The Russian Federation declared an area in the northwest of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov as exclusion zones, stating that any ship underway would be considered a terrorist. At the start of the conflict, approximately 2,000 seafarers were stranded aboard 94 vessels in Ukrainian ports. These were vessels which were loading or unloading, or just didn't have the opportunity to depart before the ports were closed. 10 vessels have subsequently safely departed the Sea of Azov, and 84 merchant ships remain, with nearly 450 seafarers on board. And this number of seafarers continues to steadily reduce. Many ships have employed Ukrainian local shipkeepers to replace their crew, and some ships have even gone into cold layup, with no crew remaining on board. In some situations, crew have chosen to remain on board. And this creates a complex picture of continually changing environment, made more complex by the challenges of communicating with ships in some locations. IMO has taken a leading role in communicating with the ships to build an awareness picture of the situation, which we share with member states, UN agencies, the International Commission of the Red Cross, charities, NGOs, and many stakeholders on the ground to support the safety of seafarers. Many ships have been hit in crossfire, and some significantly damaged or worse. At least 10 ships have been damaged, and some have sunk alongside, on moorings or at sea. Notably, the MV Helt was hit by a mine on its approach to Odessa and subsequently sank, although thankfully all the crew survived. Ukraine scuttled its flagship in the early days of the conflict. IMO has, from the start, focused on trying to promote the opening of channels to allow the stranded vessels to depart. Until now, this has not been achievable due to the security situation. However, we are fully engaged in the current UN initiative to facilitate the humanitarian export of grain from the western ports of Ukraine. Ukraine produces over 20% of the world's grain and has over 20 million tons, which needs to be exported in the next few months before this year's harvest, which begins in July. There's no storage available for the new harvest, and export over land or down the River Danube only accounts for 15% of the required exports. The group that's been established is a cross-UN group, and it's focused solely on the export of grain for humanitarian aid. Negotiations are ongoing with all stakeholders, but as you can imagine, these are complex and sensitive. The ongoing situation in Ukraine is an excellent example of just how important the security of merchant shipping is to ensure global supply chains. With 95% of all trade moving by sea, ensuring the freedom of navigation has rarely been brought more clearly into focus than it is today. Once again, I do apologise for not being able to attend at short notice, and I hope this provides a snapshot of a couple of the high priority maritime security issues that we are seeing today. I do wish you all the very best, and thank you very much for listening. That completes my brief.
De esta manera finaliza la presentación de los panelistas del día de hoy. han despertado gran interés a los participantes, por lo que hay varias preguntas. Lamentablemente, por el tiempo, van a considerarse aquellas que son comunes. En primer lugar, nos ha pedido el señor embajador de Estados Unidos, Giovanni Snidel, se le conceda la palabra. Él es asesor principal de política de seguridad hemisférica en la Oficina de Asuntos del Hemisferio Occidental de la Misión de Estados Unidos ante la Organización de Estados Americanos. Adelante, señor embajador.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. First, I would like to congratulate the Inter-American Defense Board and its staff for pulling together this very valuable webinar. In my memory, this has been really quite unique in terms of something that's offered by the board that has tremendous value for all OAS member states. So I would like to express my appreciation, but also congratulations to the Inter-American Defense Board for putting together such a relevant seminar that addresses the security issues, that addresses the blue economy issues, that addresses the need for cooperation among us. Captain Don Polo, the commanding officer of Trinidad and Tobago, in his very first slide, actually labeled it strength through unity and cooperation. And I think that has clearly shown up in all of the presentations that we've heard. I'm delighted the presentations were not just regional presentations with the challenges that we have here, but also the global issues and the global challenges that we have in terms of the importance of maritime security and maritime cooperation. What I wanted to do just very briefly is, again, bring to everyone's attention an important legal instrument that does provide a regional structure that many of our countries in the Caribbean Basin are very actively considering. This is the San Jose Treaty. Under the leadership of the Netherlands and Costa Rica, in next year in 2023, a Conference of States Parties meeting will be held. I think this seminar is a wonderful prelude to the importance of the issue. It also shows all of the challenges that we have, but it also points out all of the cooperative tools that we have. So we're delighted that in 2023, there will be this opportunity for the region to get together to discuss these significant issues, to reaffirm the treaty, and I think importantly to decide on the next step. Actively, many Caribbean countries are actually in the process of considering and ratifying the treaty. And this is an action that we would like to encourage, not just because it provides a legal tool for our naval authorities and our operators, but more importantly, it provides a regional structure for cooperation, for dialogue, and for assisting other states, parties, without impinging on sovereignty. So thank you for this opportunity to bring this to the attention of all those here in this seminar. I do hope that the link to this meeting can be shared with the Committee on Hemispheric Security so that all OAS member states can really benefit from the very rich discussion and presentations that we've had here today. Thank you for this opportunity. I have no questions because all the panelists had all the answers. This was outstanding. Thank you.
Gracias, señor embajador Giovanni Snidel, por su valiosa participación. A continuación, el almirante Ravelo manifiesta que desea felicitar a todos los ponentes por sus brillantes presentaciones e indica lo siguiente. En la presentación del general Fritz Urbach, representante de la misión de la Unión Europea en los Estados Unidos, nos presentó el enfoque de la organización sobre los problemas comunes de sus Estados miembros. En ese sentido, la pregunta a cualquiera de los ponentes es si un enfoque similar con operaciones internacionales regulares y permanentes en el Atlántico Sur, el Pacífico Sur y el Caribe sería un enfoque válido. Por favor, el que desea participar en la respuesta, le invito a que abra el micrófono y active el video.
buenos días.
Adelante, por favor.
Sí, soy el capitán de navío Diego Rolero, soy agregado naval por Uruguay y adjunto a la Junta Interamericana de Defensa. Haciendo un aporte respecto a la visión que tiene Uruguay, y lo conversamos acá en la Junta, es que estos seminarios ayudan a debatir y a generar un concepto estratégico, así como todos los informes y los documentos ayudan a generar ese concepto teórico. Pero bueno, es necesario pasar a la práctica, porque si no perdemos credibilidad. Cuando se habla mucho y poco se hace, simplemente es algo que suena, pero como dicen, perro que ladra no muerde. Creo que es momento de hacer una operación, pero cuando hablamos de operación no hablamos de ejercicios como sí tenemos históricamente, hemos realizado a través de los años, el grado de interoperabilidad que sí tenemos, pero hablamos de una patrulla marítima en el Atlántico Sur, es decir, materializar un mensaje claro para que todos entiendan que nosotros estamos convencidos y queremos materializar estas palabras en hechos y dar un mensaje a todo el contexto internacional de que nos interesa el Atlántico Sur, en este caso el Atlántico, para los demás países el Pacífico, en definitiva nuestras regiones, para poder en definitiva materializar los intereses estratégicos que cada uno de los países tenemos y que convergen en un interés común. Muchas gracias.
Muy amable por su respuesta y participación. A continuación, una pregunta para el señor contraalmirante Thomas Moninger de Estados Unidos. Debido al aumento de la piratería, terrorismo y tensión entre algunos países, ¿cuál sería su opinión en cuanto a la cooperación que podría o ya existe a nivel regional e internacional? La pregunta es para el señor contraalmirante Tomás Moninger.
Almirante Salinas, Almirante Moninger tuvo que salir. Nosotros vamos a encaminar esta pregunta por escrito para él. Gracias.
Muy amable, gracias. Pregunta del capitán Marcio Borges para la señora Tonya Ayo. ¿Cómo podrían los sistemas de vigilancia apoyar la detección y la alerta temprana de acciones ilícitas en alta mar, mejorando las acciones dentro de las aguas jurisdiccionales? ¿Podría ampliarse este sistema para apoyar acciones coordinadas en otras regiones como el Atlántico Sur y el Pacífico Sur y para compartir información con otros sistemas ya en acción? Adelante, señora Tonya Ayo.
Almirante Salinas, ¿usted puede repetir la pregunta para la señora Ayo?
Sí, claro.
Good morning again.
¿Cómo podrían los sistemas de vigilancia? Sí, voy a repetir la pregunta. ¿Cómo podrían los sistemas de vigilancia apoyar la detección y la alerta temprana de acciones ilícitas en alta mar, mejorando las acciones dentro de las aguas jurisdiccionales? ¿Podría ampliarse este sistema para apoyar acciones coordinadas en otras regiones como el Atlántico Sur y el Pacífico Sur y para compartir información con otros sistemas ya en acción?
Thank you, and apologies again for having to repeat the question. Certainly, so the system that we have in CARICOM, we are able to share information. In fact, we have recently commenced a relationship with the Maritime Analysis Operations Center in Portugal. In listening to the presentations this morning, we are in discussions with some personnel from the South Pacific, for example, as to how we can share information with them. And we actually have been asking for a contact with from entities such as ECOWAS in Africa, as to how we can share information with the authorities there. We have done this successfully on the air side, we have done this successfully through UNODC AirCup. We are aware that there is a CCUP program, and that is being introduced in the Caribbean at this point. And we are actually in the process of having discussions with the CCUP personnel to see if this is the way that we can go in actively sharing information with persons from different regions. So we are aware there are programs where we can do so. We've mastered it on the air side, but it's on the maritime side that we are looking to do that now with different regions. Thank you.
Muy amable por su respuesta, señora Doña Ayo. La última pregunta para el contraalmirante Jaime Vela de la Armada del Ecuador. Conscientes de la importancia de la Reserva Marina y áreas protegidas de las Islas Galápagos y su influencia en los factores que enriquecen los recursos ictiológicos de la región, ¿cuáles son las iniciativas o prioridades de cooperación internacional para la protección de esta área sensible en el hemisferio frente a la amenaza de la pesca ilegal no declarada, no reglamentada? Adelante, por favor, con la respuesta.
Bien, señores miembros del panel, mi almirante, señores, buenos días. En respuesta a lo mencionado y en representación de mi jefe, me presento, soy el capitán Gabriel Abad, subdirector nacional de los espacios acuáticos. Muchas gracias por la pregunta. Y efectivamente, en función de la protección de la reserva marina y más allá de la reserva marina, como alguien dijo, de los expositores de la pesca de alta mar y de las especies migratorias en especial, se está colaborando y se está gestionando con los países de la Organización Regional Pesquera del Pacífico, por un lado, y con los países de la Comisión Interamericana del Atún Tropical, por otro lado, para efectivamente hacer o mantener un esfuerzo coordinado de control de la pesca de las diferentes especies y más que nada someterlo a la, como dice la Convención de las Naciones Unidas del Derecho del Mar, someterlo a la gestión y manejo de una organización regional pesquera. Ahora, cuando se refiere a las coordinaciones o cooperaciones que podamos tener para la gestión efectiva de la protección de nuestra propia reserva marina. Como ya fue mencionado, tenemos algunos acuerdos, como por ejemplo, con la Dirección de Pesca y Océanos del Canadá, que se mencionó en la conferencia, y Global Fishing Watch, otro, y básicamente esos son centros y fuentes de tanto de datos como de análisis que nos sirven a nosotros para hacer una protección más efectiva de esos recursos dentro de la reserva marina. Eso en cuanto a la respuesta. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta adicional o concordante con la respuesta, con gusto se atiende, mi almirante. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a usted, comandante Gabriel Abad, por su respuesta. Debido al tiempo, vamos a dar por finalizado el periodo de preguntas y respuestas. De mi parte, agradezco y felicito a todos los panelistas por sus magníficas presentaciones al compartir las experiencias sobre seguridad y protección marítima en sus respectivos países, que nos han permitido alcanzar el propósito del taller a fin de desarrollar un programa de seguridad marítima en la Junta Interamericana de Defensa para mejorar la cooperación y comunicación entre las armadas del continente, contribuir a la promoción de los intereses multilaterales, fortalecer el desarrollo de capacidades de los países en el ámbito marítimo y promover la implementación de un marco de cooperación para la seguridad marítima en las Américas. Mi agradecimiento a la Junta Interamericana de Defensa por la invitación en calidad de moderador. Para finalizar, paso la voz al señor general de brigada Porfirio Fuentes, director general de la Secretaría de la Junta Interamericana de Defensa. Gracias a todos.
Muy buenas tardes. Quiero agradecer al señor embajador Anthony Phillips, embajador ante la Organización de Estados Americanos y representante permanente de Trinidad y Tobago, y como presidente de la Comisión de Seguridad Hemisférica, que ayer tuvo la amabilidad de participar en la apertura de este primer taller de seguridad marítima de la Junta Interamericana de Defensa. También quiero reconocer al contraalmirante Alexander Ravelo de Faria, presidente del Consejo de Delegados, por esta importante iniciativa para desarrollar este taller. La Junta Interamericana de Defensa, como parte de su 80 aniversario, planeó y llevar a cabo una serie de actividades para resaltar el trabajo importante de contribución al asesoramiento técnico, consultivo y educativo a la Organización de Estados Americanos. Este primer taller de seguridad marítima forma parte de todas aquellas actividades que ha planeado la Junta Interamericana como parte de su 80 aniversario. Aquí, sin duda, como lo dijo el señor Spencer en sus palabras de apertura, la atención y el reconocimiento del valor que tienen los recursos en la mar son sumamente importantes. Como alguien también lo dijo durante su ponencia, la vida comienza en el mar y se extiende hacia la parte continental. Sin duda, este espacio es vital, como el espacio terrestre, como el espacio aéreo, para la sobrevivencia de los habitantes y la seguridad de los estados. No es más importante, no es menos importante, es complementaria a la seguridad e importancia de los otros espacios. Sin duda que la vida en la mar ofrece muchas oportunidades de recursos para la sobrevivencia de los estados, pero al mismo tiempo también se constituye en una vía que permite el flujo de riesgos y desafíos para la seguridad de los estados. De ahí que la importancia para atender este espacio cada vez debe recobrar la atención primaria de quienes tienen a su cargo la responsabilidad de garantizar su permanencia y seguridad. Por ello, quiero reconocer nuevamente la visión del señor almirante para integrar este primer taller, donde hemos contado durante 2 días con la asistencia de importantes panelistas que nos hablaron sobre problemas, buenas prácticas y las posibilidades de cooperación tanto en el Atlántico Sur, Pacífico Sur, en el Caribe y el Atlántico y Pacífico Norte, así como aquellos que compartieron sus experiencias sobre internacionales, por ejemplo, de la Unión Europea, del Instituto de Estudios de Seguridad de África y de la Organización Marítima Internacional. Ello, sin duda, aportará conocimientos y oportunidades para decirles que desde hoy estas actividades forman ya parte de la planeación estratégica y de las actividades anuales que la Junta Interamericana institucionalizará para desarrollar anualmente actividades relacionadas con la seguridad marítima y actividades conexas relacionadas con este tema. Por ello, manifiesto nuestro agradecimiento a todos los panelistas que disertaron con sus temas y a nuestros modeladores que hicieron un trabajo magistral para que hoy, en esta mañana, estemos llegando a un buen término este primer taller de seguridad marítima de la Junta Interamericana de Defensa. A todos, muchas gracias y que tengan una excelente tarde.
Creio que nada mais oportuno e justo que passar a palavra à comissão de coordenação desse evento, que se dedicou para que esse evento fosse realizado e nós tivéssemos aí, nas palavras do General Fuentes, a possibilidade de institucionalizar uma nova atividade aqui na Junta. Eu gostaria de passar a palavra ao almirante Nelson Montenegro, delegado do Peru na Junta Interamericana de Defesa, para fazer o encerramento do nosso primeiro workshop de segurança marítima da JID.
Señor presidente del Consejo de Delegados de la JID, quiero aprovechar la oportunidad para complementar lo expresado por el señor general, de que este evento que se ha durado estos 2 días creo que es de gran importancia. Es de gran importancia en razón que, en primer lugar, permite a todos los participantes conocer cómo enfocamos y vemos un tema que es de gran relevancia como es la seguridad marítima, conocer cómo lo visualizan, cómo lo enfrentan y cuáles son sus capacidades para poder también nosotros retroalimentarnos, ¿no? Pero como bien se mencionó hace un momento, este primer taller de seguridad marítima yo lo defino como la primera pierna de navegación que usted ha iniciado y que esta va a ser seguida por una siguiente por el encargo que ha dado a un grupo de oficiales acá de la JID para consolidar esta información, analizarla, hacer una apreciación y elevar una propuesta para su consideración en la presidencia en demanda de que se pueda concretar operaciones conjuntas, Dios mediante, bajo un concepto de una seguridad marítima internacional o regional. Así como ahora todos los países, organizaciones gubernamentales e internacionales han expuesto y han compartido su conocimiento sobre la seguridad marítima, esto yo pienso en un mediano plazo se va a ver reflejado en el mar, ya en operaciones reales conjuntas, ¿no? Y agradezco la oportunidad de conformar ese grupo de trabajo con oficiales acá de la JID, señor presidente del Consejo de Delegados, y también las gracias a todos por compartir su conocimiento sobre el tema en cuestión. Eso sería todo y gracias nuevamente y éxitos en lo que viene.
Muito obrigado a todos, uma boa tarde, um prazer tê-los sempre a bordo. Sejam as senhoras e os senhores serão sempre bem-vindos na Junta Interamericana de Defesa. Obrigado.